blizzard that night was fiercer than usual. Wind howled like a warning through the cracks in the old wooden cabin, where Margaret Ellison was quietly warming a bowl of soup over her wood-burning stove. At 82, she had grown used to the deep, constant silence of Minnesota winters. A silence broken only by the occasional pop of burning logs and the slow, steady tick of the wall clock above the fireplace. Since her husband George passed 17 years earlier, solitude had become her daily companion. Her children lived far away now, and the phone rang less and less each year. But that night, something broke the silence. First came a low rumble in the distance, then another, and another. Heavy, mechanical sounds, unmistakably engines, cutting through the snowstorm. Margaret pulled the curtain back and gasped softly. Through the swirling snow, 20 men trudged toward her home, all dressed in heavy leather jackets, their faces hidden beneath frost-covered beanies. Standing beside them were 10 large German shepherds, each one alert, silent, and dusted in white. Her instincts told her to be cautious, maybe even afraid. But Margaret's heart didn't move in fear. It moved in compassion. She slowly opened the front door, letting the wind push inside. An older man stepped forward, tall, with a gray beard and eyes that spoke of long roads and harder years. He removed his cap and said respectfully, "Ma'am, we're stranded. The storm hit faster than we expected. Phones are dead. We just need a place to stay for the night. Just warmth. Please." Margaret looked past him to the others, exhausted, soaked, shivering, and then to the dogs standing still as soldiers. Something stirred in her. An old memory of George and his beloved shepherd, Bear. Her voice was quiet, but firm. "Come in, all of you, and bring the dogs." Inside, the small cabin became a makeshift refuge. Coats were hung by the stove. Dogs were laid out on towels. Margaret moved slowly, but with purpose, opening cans of soup, passing out blankets, pouring mugs of weak tea. Not one man complained. They said little, but their eyes softened when they looked at her. These weren't criminals. They were tired men, veterans as she'd later learn, marked by war and bonded by loyalty, not just to each other, but to the animals at their sides. Margaret sat back in her rocking chair, heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. The warmth in the room wasn't just from the fire, it came from something deeper. But that feeling wouldn't last. Because the next morning, as she opened the door for firewood, she froze. 10 police officers stood in the snow outside her home, and every one of them was staring straight at her. Margaret didn't move at first. The cold wind whipped against her thin nightgown, but she barely felt it. Her eyes locked on the line of police officers standing in the snow, serious, silent, and positioned like they were preparing for something far worse than an old woman opening her door. Officer Daniel McBride stepped forward, removing his glove before speaking. "Ma'am, is everything all right in there?" His tone was cautious, not unkind, but edged with suspicion. Margaret, still gripping the doorframe, hesitated. "Yes, I think so," she replied softly. "There are 20 men and 10 dogs sleeping on my floor, if that's what you're asking." Inside, the sound of boots stirring broke the quiet. Jack Rollins was already up, standing behind her, his broad figure filling the narrow hallway. His beard was wet from melted snow, his expression unreadable. Margaret could feel the tension rise behind her like a wave. Officer McBride glanced past her shoulder, his hand resting lightly on his belt. "Are you Jack Rollins?" he asked. Jack gave a slow nod. "Yes, sir." McBride's jaw tightened. "You and your group were reported missing 2 days ago. There were concerns that something might have gone wrong." It wasn't a hostile tone, but it wasn't friendly either. Jack stepped outside, followed by a few of the other men, including Thomas Hawk Green and Mike Diesel Lawson. None of them looked afraid, but there was caution in every movement. The dogs stayed inside, quiet and still, as if sensing that their presence might escalate things. Margaret crossed her arms over her chest, standing firm between them and the officers. "They came here in the middle of a blizzard," she said, louder than she'd expected. "Hungry, freezing, and respectful. I let them in because I wasn't going to let good men, or their dogs, die in the snow. Officer Linda Reyes stepped forward then, her voice softer. No one's in trouble, ma'am. We're just here to make sure everyone's safe. That includes you. Her eyes met Margaret's with genuine care, and for the first time, the older woman felt her grip on the moment loosen. Jack turned to her, lowering his head slightly. If we caused you any harm or worry, you didn't, Margaret cut in. You reminded me what it means to take care of someone. A long pause followed, snowflakes falling silently between the two groups. Then McBride spoke again. We'll need to talk with all of you, one by one. Just routine. Margaret didn't move from the doorway. She looked at the officers, then back at the men who had slept under her roof. Something in her eyes changed, not fear, but defiance. And without turning, she said quietly, "You'll have to come inside for that." The cabin, once a sanctuary of silence, now buzzed with quiet tension. Inside, the officers had removed their hats and gloves out of respect, but the air remained heavy. Jack sat at the kitchen table, his hands resting flat on the worn wood, while Officer McBride stood across from him, notebook in hand. The questions came one at a time, direct, polite, but calculated. Where were you heading? Why take that route? Why didn't anyone call for help sooner? Jack answered calmly, but Margaret, seated nearby with a blanket over her lap, could hear the strain beneath his voice. In the corner, Hawk paced slowly, arms crossed, visibly agitated. His military posture never left him, and his eyes scanned each officer as if still searching for threats. Diesel sat near the fireplace, his large frame hunched over, quietly feeding the dogs bits of leftover bread. Ranger lay at Jack's feet, head resting on his paws, eyes alert. The dogs hadn't barked once since the police arrived. They simply watched, waiting, as if understanding every word. Officer Reyes took a seat beside Margaret. "He's a good man," Margaret said softly, her voice carrying weight. "They all are. I don't care what you've heard." Reyes didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked around the room, the patched-up furniture, the photo of George in uniform above the mantel, the tattered quilt draped over Margaret's knees. "We haven't heard anything bad," she said eventually, "but there are questions." 10 years ago, Jack Rollins was connected to an incident, a fire. A man went missing. Margaret turned her head slowly. "That was a long time ago," Reyes nodded. "But not forgotten, especially not by Officer McBride." The words lingered like smoke. Across the room, McBride stiffened slightly, as if sensing his name. Jack looked up, meeting McBride's eyes. "You still believe I had something to do with it?" he asked quietly. McBride didn't flinch. "I believe a man doesn't disappear without reason." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft crackling of the fire. Margaret's voice rose again, firmer this time. "Whatever happened back then has nothing to do with who these men are today. You're looking for suspects in a room full of survivors." Jack didn't look away from McBride. "I didn't come here to hide," he said. "We were running from the storm, not from ghosts." Outside, the snow was beginning to let up, but inside the storm was just beginning. Margaret could feel it in her bones. The past wasn't finished with them, not yet. And as she glanced toward the window, she saw headlights approaching through the trees. The headlights cut through the thinning snow like twin blades of light, swaying gently as the vehicle navigated the narrow path toward the cabin. Everyone inside paused. McBride instinctively reached for his radio, while Jack stood from the table, his body tense. Margaret didn't move. She just stared at the window, her fingers gripping the armrest of her chair as if bracing for something she couldn't name. Hawk moved to the front door without a word, placing himself between the entrance and the others, his instinct to protect kicking in like muscle memory. The engine stopped. A car door slammed. Then another. 2 figures appeared in the darkness, approaching slowly. One tall, one smaller. As they stepped into view, Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the silhouette before she even saw the face. Susan, her daughter, the last person Margaret ever expected or wanted to see tonight. Behind her, a younger man, early 30s, clean-cut, wearing a long wool coat. He held a folder in one hand and kept his distance. Susan stepped onto the porch, brushing snow from her shoulders. She didn't knock. She simply opened the door like someone who still believed she had the right. Her eyes swept across the room, from the officers to the veterans to her mother. "What's going on here?" she asked, not accusing, but not gentle either. Margaret stood slowly. "You tell me," she replied. "I haven't heard from you in over a year. Now you arrive in the middle of a snowstorm with a stranger." The young man stepped forward. "My name is Alan Price. I'm with the Department of Veterans Affairs." He glanced around the room, clearly uneasy. "We've been trying to locate Jack Rollins and Thomas Green regarding a reopened investigation tied to a fire in 2013. His voice was polite but official, cold even. Jack didn't react. He simply stared at the man like he was a ghost from a life he no longer claimed. Hawk muttered something under his breath and turned away. Susan looked at her mother again, eyes softer now. "I didn't know you were living like this." Margaret straightened. "Like what? Independently? With dignity? Surrounded by people who still know what loyalty means?" Her voice cracked at the edge, but she held firm. Susan didn't respond. Instead, she stepped further inside, uncertain whether she belonged there at all. Alan pulled a folded paper from his coat and handed it to McBride. "This isn't just a welfare check anymore," he said. "There's an official summons involved." Jack looked at the document briefly, then turned toward the fire. Margaret saw it in his face, the way his shoulders sank just slightly. Something was unraveling, and she had no idea how far it would go. The cabin was suddenly too quiet. The folded paper now in Officer McBride's hands weighed heavier than anything else in the room. Margaret could sense it, not just in Jack's posture, but in the way Hawk stopped pacing, how Diesel looked away, and how the dogs sat up, ears perked like they could feel the shift in energy. Jack didn't look at anyone. He kept his eyes on the flames dancing in the fireplace. "So it's back," he said quietly. "After all these years." McBride opened the document carefully, his expression unreadable. Alan Price stood beside him, stiff as stone. The department reopened the case after new evidence surfaced. Someone came forward, someone who claims to have been there the night of the fire. His voice was calm, clinical. Jack didn't flinch. "That was a decade ago," he replied. 10 winters have passed. Why now?" Alan didn't answer. Instead, McBride asked the question Margaret had feared would come. "Did you start that fire, Jack?" Silence. Only the soft whimper of one of the dogs broke it. Jack finally stood and turned to face them all. "No, I didn't. But I didn't stop it either." His words fell heavy. Hawk exhaled sharply and stepped forward. "He took the blame for something that wasn't his doing. We all did. We were trying to protect someone." McBride raised an eyebrow. "Protect who?" Diesel looked up from the floor, his voice low and raw. "A boy, one of ours. Young, scared. He didn't mean to. It got out of control." Margaret watched them closely. These weren't criminals. They were men haunted by guilt, bound by a decision made in the heat of fear. "You carried that secret for 10 years?" she asked softly. Jack nodded. "We couldn't ruin his life. He had a shot at something better." The emotion in his voice was thick now. "We thought we were doing the right thing. Maybe we were wrong." Susan, who had remained quiet near the door, finally spoke. "And how many people suffered because of it?" Her voice trembled with both anger and confusion. "You think silence makes you noble? It makes you responsible." Margaret turned to her. "It makes them human." McBride folded the paper and put it in his coat. "This changes things," he said. "We'll need to take statements. Officially." Jack nodded once. "Whatever it takes." But as he sat back down beside the fire, Margaret could see something shifting behind his eyes. He wasn't just bracing for consequences. He was preparing for a truth that hadn't yet come to light. As the officers began preparing their official reports, The cabin lost a little of the warmth it had gained the night before. Margaret watched quietly from her chair while Jack sat motionless beside the fire, his hands folded in his lap. Diesel leaned against the far wall, eyes closed, and Hawk paced again, slower this time, as if each step carried weight. The dogs remained close to their humans, not restless, but alert. They could feel it too. Something inside the room had changed for good. Margaret's eyes drifted to the photo above the fireplace. George, dressed in his uniform, smiling the way he used to before the war changed him. She remembered how he used to say, "Truth is like snow. It may cover things for a while, but eventually it melts." Those words echoed now more than ever. Her voice broke the silence. "I remember that fire," she said suddenly, surprising everyone. McBride turned. "You do?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Not much, just the smoke. The smell. I lived near the woods back then. I didn't see who started it, but I saw who tried to stop it." All eyes turned to her. She continued, voice steady but low. "There were 3 of them. One was tall, had a limp. Another carried someone on his back, a teenager unconscious. And one of them was screaming for help, waving his arms. I never told anyone. I was afraid the wrong person would get blamed." Jack looked up slowly, the color draining from his face. "That was us," he whispered. "You saw us." Margaret nodded again. "I didn't understand at the time, but I do now. You weren't running from the fire, you were trying to save someone from it." Hawk stopped pacing. Diesel opened his eyes. Susan stepped forward, her voice unsure. "Why didn't you say anything?" Margaret met her daughter's gaze. "Because no one asked. And because people like your father taught me to wait before judging." McBride stepped forward, his voice softer now. "This could help, but we still need that young man's name, the one you were protecting." Jack exhaled slowly. "He's a firefighter now, a good one, stationed in Duluth. His name is Tyler McBride." The silence that followed hit like thunder. Officer Daniel McBride's face went pale. He opened his mouth but said nothing. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room knew. The truth had just landed right at his feet. For a long moment, no one moved. The wind outside had calmed, but inside the cabin, the air was thick. Not with hostility, but with shock. Officer Daniel McBride stood frozen, the name Tyler McBride echoing in his mind like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. His lips parted, then closed again. He turned away as if trying to steady himself, but his hand trembled slightly. Jack remained still, watching him without judgment, only a quiet understanding. Margaret could see it clearly now, the way Daniel's shoulders sagged under the weight of the truth. She rose slowly from her chair and walked toward him. "You didn't know?" she asked gently. He shook his head. "He never told me. Said the fire was started by some careless kids. I never connected the dots." His voice cracked. "He was 17. Said he found the fire, tried to help." Jack finally spoke. "He did help. He saved someone that night. We just made sure he never paid for the panic that started it." Hawk stepped forward, his voice calm. "He lit the fire trying to stay warm. That's all it was. Bad timing. Dry season. One wrong spark. We were all there and we all agreed he had a future. We didn't." Diesel added, "He begged us not to tell. Said he couldn't face his father, the cop. Said you'd never look at him the same way." Daniel sat down, slowly, like his legs couldn't hold him anymore. He looked at his hands. "He was right," he whispered. "Back then, I wouldn't have." Susan stood by the window, arms crossed, but her expression had softened. "And now?" she asked. Daniel looked up at her, then at Margaret, then finally at Jack. "Now I don't know what to believe. I spent 10 years chasing ghosts while my son lived with guilt I never saw." Margaret stepped beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe this isn't about blame anymore. Maybe it's about what you all do with the truth now that it's finally here." Silence again. But this time it wasn't heavy, it was thoughtful. Something had shifted in that room. The weight hadn't disappeared, but it had been shared. Daniel looked at Jack and nodded, slowly. "Thank you for protecting him, even if I wish he hadn't needed it." Jack gave a faint smile. He didn't need protection. He needed a second chance. And for the first time since the police arrived, the fire inside the cabin no longer felt like it was holding back a storm. It felt like it was lighting a way forward. The cabin felt different now. Not quieter, but calmer. The storm outside had fully passed, leaving behind a glassy coat of frost on the windows. Inside, the heat from the fire lingered, and with it came a sense of stillness that had nothing to do with temperature. For the first time since the veterans had arrived, no one was rushing to defend, explain, or accuse. They just sat, together. Daniel remained seated at the kitchen table, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of his coffee mug. Margaret had brewed a fresh pot for everyone, and even Hawk accepted a cup this time. Jack stood near the fireplace, one hand resting on Ranger's head. The dog had hardly moved from his side since the officers arrived. Diesel was dozing in the armchair, his boots off, socks drying beside the hearth. Susan watched all of them, quiet, thoughtful, but no longer cold. She stepped into the center of the room and spoke. "I used to think my mother was stubborn, that she clung to the past because she didn't want to accept change." Margaret looked at her, eyebrows raised, but said nothing. "But maybe it wasn't that. Maybe she just understood something I never did. That some things, kindness, loyalty, forgiveness, they don't go out of style." Margaret gave a small smile. "Took you long enough." Alan Price, still standing off to the side, finally cleared his throat. "I'll need to report all of this to the VA, but given what's been said, I think we can make a case for closing this quietly, especially if Officer McBride is willing to provide context." Daniel looked up at him, then nodded slowly. "I'll write the truth, not the version I thought I knew." It was a small statement, but a powerful one. And in that moment, a decade's worth of weight began to lift. Jack turned toward the group. "We weren't running from justice," he said. "We were just trying to protect something that mattered. But maybe we stayed quiet for too long." Hawk added, "The silence helped no one in the end. It just left scars where there could have been healing." Margaret looked around at all of them. These men, these officers, her daughter, and felt something shift deep in her chest. Not pain, not sorrow, peace. Outside, the snow had stopped falling completely. Sunlight peeked through the clouds, casting a pale golden glow across the yard. The storm had passed, in every sense of the word, but the next choice still had to be made. By the time afternoon came, the cabin was no longer just a place of shelter. It had become a kind of sacred ground. Everyone moved a little slower now, as if aware that something meaningful had just taken place and that rushing would dishonor it. Margaret stood by the window, looking out at the glistening snow-covered trees. The sun had broken through the clouds, and for the first time in days, she could see blue sky beyond the frost. Jack approached her quietly. "We'll be heading out soon," he said. His voice was low, calm, but Margaret could hear the hesitation behind it. She turned to him, resting one frail hand on his arm. "You could stay a little longer," she said gently. Jack gave a soft smile. "We've already stayed longer than we planned. The road's calling again. Always does." She nodded, but her eyes told another story, one of connection formed too quickly to be easily let go. At the table, Daniel sat with Hawk and Diesel, helping them fill out the remaining forms Alan Price had provided. It was a strange sight. A police officer laughing softly with two bikers over shared war stories and black coffee. Whatever history they carried now felt like something acknowledged, not hidden. The truth had not broken them. In some ways, it had rebuilt them. Daniel looked over to Jack. "When you see Tyler," he said, tell him I understand now, and I'm proud of who he became." Jack gave a slow, respectful nod. "I will." There was weight in his words, the kind that only comes from knowing a burden had finally shifted off someone else's back. Susan, who had been helping Margaret pack away dishes, paused and stepped over. She looked at her mother for a long moment, then embraced her tightly. It wasn't forced, nor dramatic. just a quiet acknowledgement that distance didn't have to last forever. "You were right," she whispered. "About all of it." Margaret didn't reply with words. She simply held her daughter closer, tears welling in her tired eyes. Sometimes healing didn't need grand speeches, just presence, just touch, just time. When they parted, Susan walked over to Alan and whispered something. He nodded and handed her a folded paper before stepping outside to prepare the car. As Jack and the others gathered their things, the dogs began to stir, tails wagging, eyes bright. The storm had passed. The house was warm, but outside the road was waiting. And this time they wouldn't be running from anything. The motorcycles started one by one, breaking the stillness of the cold morning with their deep, rumbling growl. Margaret stood on the porch wrapped in her heaviest coat, her gloved hands gripping the railing as she watched the men and their dogs prepare to leave. The snow had begun to soften under the sun's slow rise, and the sky was a bright, clean blue. It felt like the first true morning of the year, not just in season, but in spirit. Jack walked up the steps one last time, holding his helmet under his arm. Ranger stood by his side, tail wagging gently. "Thank you, Margaret," Jack said. His voice was quieter than usual. "Not just for the shelter, but for reminding us what kindness looks like." Margaret smiled softly. "Don't wait another 10 years to tell your story again," she said. "The world's starving for truth, and for people like you." Jack nodded, and for a moment, they simply looked at one another. Not as strangers, but as two people who had carried more than they ever said aloud. Susan stood beside her mother now, watching the veterans with a different expression. Something had shifted in her too. She reached into her coat pocket and handed Jack the folded paper Alan had given her earlier, the one she had asked him for privately. "It's an invitation," she said, "to speak at the Veterans Center in Chicago. They're looking for real stories. Yours matters." Jack took the paper, glanced at it, then slipped it inside his jacket. "I'll think about it," he said. Hawk and Diesel approached next, each offering quiet nods and a handshake. "You've got good coffee," Diesel said with a rare smirk. Hawk added, "And a better soul than most folks we've met in cities twice this size." Margaret laughed, her voice warm. "That's because cities forget people. Out here, we remember." Then she leaned down and scratched behind one of the dog's ears. "You remember too, don't you?" The dog nuzzled her gently, as if saying goodbye. The men mounted their bikes, and with one last glance, they turned toward the road. Margaret and Susan watched as the group disappeared slowly into the trees, their silhouettes growing smaller against the snow and sunlight. No more sirens, no more questions, just the quiet hum of engines and peace. Margaret exhaled, long and slow, and turned to her daughter. "You staying a while?" Susan smiled, slipping her arm around her mother's. "Yeah, Mom, I'm staying." And for the first time in years, the house didn't feel quiet. It felt full.